We recently crossed a very important benchmark in this country, which is for the first time ever, more than half the land that is cultivated in this country. The more worrying thing, of course, is the fact that the El-Nino is now confirmed, but RBI is still worried about inflation, thinks that there could be inflationary spikes or shocks, and is clearly worried about the weather, about the El-Nino and its effect on the monsoon. But the most important subtext of the Reserve Bank of India's announcement this week was the tone that it took on inflation. It made it very clear that it was worried about inflation, made it very clear that 4% was its inflation target, and also made it very clear that if there is a growth boost that has to come, it has to come from the government. In one of those very interesting coincidences, the India Meteorological Department declared the onset of the monsoon over Kerala yesterday, that is Thursday, 8th June, the same day that it was confirmed that there was indeed an El-Nino effect this year. How these two are related and the impact this is already having in many other dimensions, including perhaps the Reserve Bank of India's decision to hold interest rates, is what we are going to be talking about today. There's no doubt about the fact that the monsoon is critical to India. We recently crossed a very important benchmark in this country, which is for the first time ever, more than half the land that is cultivated in this country has got irrigation. That's 51%, which means 49% is still rain fed. And this 49% accounts for around 40% of the agricultural output. So if the rains are bad, 40% of the agricultural output gets hit, the rural economy gets hit. Already there is tepid demand, especially in the rural economy, as evident in the fact that sales of 100cc motorcycles, which are entry level, hugely popular in rural areas, is really very low, probably the lowest it's ever been in a long time. So the monsoon is critical, and this year it was delayed. Usually the onset is on June 1, this year the onset was on June 8th, and even that is a weak onset the way most people are describing it. It's quite likely that the monsoon still hasn't arrived, although IMD has declared it. We must remember that last year IMD declared the monsoon in a hurry, even before all the criteria was not met. But that's because there are so many aspects to declaring a monsoon, right? I mean, there is an economic aspect to it, there's also a political aspect to it, and I think IMD has various kinds of factors that it takes into account before declaring whether there is onset or not. But what most people are in agreement is that the progression of the monsoon is going to be very slow over the initial weeks, and that the intensity of the monsoon is going to be low over the initial weeks. And even the India Meteorological Department has accepted that in June the rains will be deficient, which means part of the sowing season, because June and the first half of July is really the sowing season for what is called the monsoon sown crop in this country, which is harvested in winter. And this is typically rice in many parts of the country, including in the northern grain belt, the food bowl of the country. And that planting is now going to be delayed, that sowing is now going to be delayed. What impact this has on output is something we'll have to wait and watch. The more worrying thing, of course, is the fact that the El-Nino is now confirmed. This is basically a weather phenomenon where waters become warmer in the eastern equatorial Pacific Ocean. Now that's really far away from where we are sitting right now, but it does have an impact on the monsoon, because there have been 19 El-Nino years in the last few decades, 19, and out of those 19 El-Nino years, in 15 years there's been an impact on the monsoon, right? And so there is clearly a correlation, and I think this is something that is worrying a lot of people. It's quite likely that this may have been preying on the Reserve Bank of India's mind, because it held its interest rates. Now interest rates have gone up by 2.5 percentage points since last May. and in many cases it's affected a lot of retail borrowers. At one end, it means fixed deposit rates have gone up, so people who've invested in fixed deposits are happy. But there are a lot of people who've taken home loans, for instance, and there are instances where home loan durations now go well beyond a person's retirement. Not exactly the best thing to do, because banks don't increase the amount, also because consumers will complain, so they just increase the loan period, and in many cases the loan period has been significantly stretched. Very, very worrying trend, because as this happens, it immediately affects the tendency of these people to spend on other things, so their discretionary spends go down. It's not a great thing for the economy, but RBI is still worried about inflation, thinks that there could be inflationary spikes or shocks, and is clearly worried about the weather, about the El-Nino and its effect on the monsoon. But if it ends up being a normal monsoon, then we could perhaps start seeing a rate cut towards the end of the year, and maybe one early next year, which will bring a lot of relief to retail borrowers and of course also corporate borrowers. But the most important subtext of the Reserve Bank of India's announcement this week was the tone that it took on inflation. It made it very clear that it was worried about inflation, made it very clear that 4% was its inflation target, and also made it very clear that if there is a growth boost that has to come, it has to come from the government, which means it has to come from the fiscal side. And one possible area which is, it's like a low-hanging fruit, is probably fuel rates can be brought down. So, it's probably time that the government started thinking about that, given the fact that there are elections due towards the end of this year and the national election next year. The government could well be thinking along these lines.